When progressives claim democracy as the justifying principle for their latest crime against humanity, the automatic conservative retort is, well, thankfully America is a republic, not a democracy. While that is historically true, few Republican voters have really considered the difference. If pressed, conservatives will cite the election of representatives rather than direct democracy as the key difference. When I taught civics in public school, this was the canned answer that we fed to the students. It's also completely inaccurate. Many conservatives claim that they'd like to return to the values and traditions of the Founding Fathers, but that's very difficult to do without first understanding the historical and philosophical context of those traditions. To that end, in this episode, we're going to be investigating the nature of republics, evaluating whether that label accurately applies to the current government of the United States, and determining whether we can return to a republican form of government if we lost it. Monarchy is the most universal form of government on the planet, but even the nature of monarchy varies widely for each particular people who practice it. In many monarchical systems, like ancient Egypt or China, the god-king reigns. But even when the English had a meaningful kingship, their sovereign was always limited by documents like the Magna Carta. The Anglo tradition has never been comfortable with the concentration of power in a single figure, even when recognizing the need for a powerful executive. The American tradition, itself Anglo-Protestant in nature, took this one step further by creating a federated republic with a mixed constitution. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, no relation, claimed that for any tradition to survive, it must be able to overcome an epistemological crisis, not just by resolving the crisis at hand, but by having a coherent explanation for why the crisis arose and why the tradition had to undergo modification. By exploring the classic understanding of what defines a republic, we'll be better able to understand whether a crisis has indeed taken place and whether we can reconstitute that tradition, or if, as Machiavelli put it, the founding of new modes and orders is necessary. Americans often treat the Constitution as some piece of novel political technology that created the form of the Republic while solving politics in perpetuity. In reality, the Republic is an ancient form of government with a tradition stretching from Aristotle to Machiavelli to the American founders like John Adams, who cited Machiavelli as an influence. For all of these thinkers, the virtue of the citizen was the key that enabled republics to flourish. Citizens didn't hold their status as voters simply because they happened to be living inside the borders of the country. Expressing political will was the purview of the patriarch, who had proven himself capable of owning property, caring for an extended family, and defending his domain through violence when necessary. It was the need to master and maintain these domains that cultivated virtue and made one worthy of participating in the body politic. Each of these thinkers also acknowledged the willingness of the citizen to take up arms as a key aspect of republican government. Aristotle said that the citizen is he who is armed. Machiavelli made the need for a citizen militia a central theme through all of his political works. In his Art of War, the Italian political thinker argued against the use of both mercenaries and standing armies, which would create a separate soldier class. For the Republic to maintain its virtue, every citizen must be willing to serve in his own defense and the defense of the nation. Service guarantees citizenship is the famous line from Robert Heinlein's novel Starship Troopers, but he's only echoing an ancient sentiment. The franchise exists for those who are willing to face danger and overcome it for the sake of the Republic. Alexander Hamilton acknowledged this tradition while arguing in Federalist 24 and 29 that the states should turn their militias over to the central government to avoid the need for a standing army. Quote, "If a well-regulated militia be the most natural defense of a free country, it ought certainly to be under the regulation and at the disposal of the body which is constituted the guardian of the national security. If standing armies are dangerous to liberty, an efficacious power over the militia, in the body to whose care the protection of the state is committed, ought, as far as possible, to take away the inducement and the pretext to such unfriendly institutions. If the federal government can command the aid of the militia in those emergencies which call for the military arm in support of the civil magistrate, it can the better dispense with the employment of a different kind of force. If it cannot avail itself of the former, it will be obliged to recur to the latter. To render an army unnecessary will be a more certain method of preventing its existence than 1,000 prohibitions upon paper." End quote. This is why we see so much confusion over the language of the Second Amendment. The citizen militia was assumed to be the default mode of armed defense for a free republic. Of course, every individual had a right to bear arms. How else could the United States protect itself? To be clear, none of this validates the leftist claim that the Second Amendment is somehow outdated. The right to self-defense doesn't cease to exist because the United States has a professional military. But it is important to understand the context in which these critical documents were written. Hamilton would continue the push towards a standing American military, but he had to acknowledge and address the deep apprehension of them inside the Republican tradition. The founders were also familiar with the need for a cohesive cultural identity as the foundation of the Republic. In Federalist No. 2, John Jay wrote, quote, "With equal pleasure I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence." End quote. Admittedly, Jay was engaged in a bit of wish casting as this statement was not entirely accurate when it was made, but he recognized that it needed to become accurate if the nation was to succeed. Hey guys, Blaze TV just dropped an explosive investigation and you need to see it. It's been 5 years since the George Floyd riots turned Minneapolis upside down, and now, for the first time ever, 3 active-duty Minneapolis police officers are speaking out on camera anonymously to tell you the truth about what really happened. These guys were on the front lines when the 3rd Precinct was abandoned and burned. They're still on the job, still in uniform, and what they reveal about Derek Chauvin, Governor Tim Walz, and the breakdown of law and order in that city is absolutely jaw-dropping. They say that Chauvin was railroaded, that Walz completely failed them, and that they're risking their lives every day in a city that's turned its back on them. Here's the deal. You can watch the first 10 minutes for free right now on YouTube. Just search Blaze TV Minneapolis. But to see the full unfiltered investigation, you've got to be a Blaze TV subscriber. So head over to blazetv.com/Auron and get $20 off your subscription. That's blazetv.com/Auron. One thing that conservatives rarely consider when arguing in favor of Republican governance is whether the form has any inherent limitations. As mentioned previously, Machiavelli argued that standing armies are a danger to Republican government because they create a separate military class, destroying the equality among the citizens, diminishing their virtue, and incentivizing a policy of conquest lest bored and unpaid soldiers turn against their host nation. In his book Thoughts on Machiavelli, Leo Strauss expands on this argument, warning that imperial republics will unwisely extend their franchise to the unworthy because their manpower and commitment is needed to expand. Strauss warns that the desire to expand usually requires the liberal admission of foreigners for citizenship, which increases domestic strife and leads to the degradation of virtue. Those that join the Republic in this manner are primarily concerned with wealth, and the Imperial Republic quickly becomes a machine for enriching its new mercenary citizens, leading to its demise. Now we have to face a reality of our time. Power always seeks to expand its borders and centralize control for a reason. If France gains the power to draft its entire male population for military service, surrounding nations can find a justification to do the same thing, or likely be crushed by a more powerful foe. The Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and the United States all developed different rationale for mass propaganda, economic centralization, and mass military production, but they developed them simultaneously for a reason. Power is an arms race, and no matter how much you oppose the use of something like nuclear weapons, once your enemy has one, you can either develop your own or become a smoldering wasteland. In the modern world, scale has proved to be a devastating weapon of its own, and nothing destroys Republican governance as effectively as scale. The geopolitical reality in our age is one of large standing armies, overseas imperial holdings, and sprawling networks of global trade. The nations that have been successful have indulged deeply in these practices. These are also the various behaviors that have been identified as the ruin of Republican governance. The large bureaucratic structures required to scale government to this level take on responsibilities that were once the domain of citizens and communities, destroying the opportunity to cultivate and exercise virtue. The mass immigration required to feed the managerial state apparatus fractures national identity, and mass democracy extends the franchise to the unworthy. The idea of personal duty and virtue are tossed aside as every faction uses their political clout to carve out a piece of the pie that must continue to expand lest it be consumed by the interests it has created. Tens of millions of illegal immigrants now reside in the United States, expecting amnesty to deliver voting rights to them and birthright citizenship to automatically secure the franchise for their children. The idea of the citizen militia is well in the rearview mirror, as the United States maintains a large standing army which takes on the character of a hereditary class as fewer and fewer Americans outside the military interact with service members. Foreign war for the purpose of expanding or maintaining the American empire is constant. The press is even finally admitting that Joe Biden was never really the president, which makes a mockery of the notion of popular sovereignty. While the founders intended for this nation to exist as a republic, they warned that it would only remain one if we fought to keep it that way. It is very difficult to argue that we have done so successfully. While the United States may no longer be accurately classified as a republic, that political formula still holds great power as it lies at the foundation of our tradition. People still speak in the language of constitutionally restrained government, expecting the fruits of a virtuous society even if they don't understand how to cultivate it. This means that while the Republican tradition in America may be on life support, it's not dead, and it's worth exploring whether it can be revived. In his essay, Nationalism, Old and New, the political commentator and theorist Samuel Francis outlined the tension between the original federated republican model and the unified national empire desired by figures like Alexander Hamilton. That battle existed at the very beginning of the country, and despite the Republican tradition being deeply implanted in the American people, the advantages of scale and the desire for centralization slowly pulled toward unified nationalism. This national centralization stripped away the cultural particularities that were protected by the regional and federated nature of the republic, as it attempted to bring every citizen under the direct control of Washington. Large bureaucratic organizations were erected to manage the American population, offering to take away burdensome responsibilities like the education of children or care for the elderly. At every step, the bureaucratic structure also robbed the population of the responsibility and self-reliance necessary for the cultivation of virtue, making Republican governance increasingly impossible. For Francis, this unified imperial nationalism was always at odds with the true nature of the American Republic, and he believed that it would inevitably doom the Republic just as Machiavelli had predicted. Instead of pining for a tradition that he venerated but ultimately believed to be extinct, Francis suggested that the right embrace a new nationalism that was not hostile to the interests of the American people. The political theorists believed that the revolution of scale had made republicanism obsolete, and that the conservatives should deal with this reality. According to Francis, the American people were no longer independent and virtuous. They had become reliant on mass bureaucratic institutions to survive in the modern world. Francis envisioned a revolution from the middle, where the mass bureaucratic institutions which had become hostile to middle Americans were instead operated for their benefit. The federated republic just wasn't coming back, so conservatives had to deal with that reality, and at least middle Americans could have a government that benefited them instead of hating them. Leviathan was here to stay, but perhaps it could be turned towards the good of the people. I admire the incredible prescience that Francis often demonstrated, but I must say in this case I believe he may have been wrong. The author wrote this essay over 30 years ago, and while at the time it seemed like scale was winning in every domain, we're now seeing that it also has serious downsides. The massive bureaucracies of the United States have turned on their citizens, but they have also become bloated, sclerotic, and incompetent. Airlines have an increasingly difficult time operating their services. Global supply chains endure significant disruption, and educational institutions find it almost impossible to graduate students with the ability to read and write properly. I'm not going to be able to properly elaborate on every argument for why I think mass managerial bureaucracies are doomed to fail, but I've done so in my book The Total State, as well as many videos on this channel, so if you'd like to know more, you can check them out. The point is that the reign of quantity may be coming to an end. And if so, the opportunity for proper Republican government might reemerge. While the solution offered by Francis is a practical one, it's ultimately undesirable if it can be avoided. Francis himself made the argument that reliance on these mass centralized organizations would continue to degrade the virtue of Americans, even if they were reformed to serve the population in a benevolent manner. His solution was to use bureaucratic institutions to instill an ethic of solidarity, discipline, and sacrifice that would ultimately overcome the deleterious impact of scale, but I'm doubtful that this will ultimately solve the problem. The limitations of the political formula must be recognized, and just as republics have a problem with scale, unified mass bureaucracy has a problem with virtue and self-reliance. It just can't produce them. The power of scale had an impressive run for a few hundred years, but the long string of victories has come to an end. The turn away from massification will not be immediate, but we can already see the first steps being taken. Donald Trump seeks to remove the United States from large international bodies like NATO and the World Health Organization and is pushing to reshore American industry. It's increasingly obvious that perpetual imperial expansion and global financial entanglement are a detriment to the American people. Domestically, the president is dismantling bureaucracies that are openly hostile to middle Americans, like the Department of Education, just as Samuel Francis suggested. If the power of scale diminishes and more authority is devolved back down to the states and communities, then the possibility of returning to Republican governance reemerges. If not, then the middle American nationalism of Sam Francis may be the only path forward. If that's the case, then we will have met the conditions Alistair MacIntyre set out for a tradition which is able to overcome a crisis. The Founding Fathers would not be wrong, they would have devised exactly the right system of government for the reality of their time. But the reality of scale in the modern world would have brought the viability of the system to its natural end. We could continue to honor the founders and carry on the spirit of their tradition while having a coherent explanation as to why that tradition had to undergo change. Ultimately, I believe that the failure of massification will mean a return to the Republican form of government is possible. But the good news is that whether I'm right or Francis is right, the solution in the meantime is the same. We must work the solution at both ends, with Trump cutting hostile bureaucracies, reforming foreign and economic policy, and orienting the remaining institutions of the United States towards the well-being of middle Americans. At the regional level, we must rebuild robust communities and local institutions. Churches, fraternal societies, and civil organizations must return to prominence, helping to free local communities from dependence on centralized bureaucracies while encouraging the development of virtue. We must produce the kind of leaders who will be able to act in the interests of the American people, whether their future be the revivification of the Republican tradition or the embrace of a new middle American nationalism. Thanks everybody for watching. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and click like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do so. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform, and if you do, leave a rating or a review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter or Substack or Instagram, if you'd like to watch these videos on Rumble or Odyssey, the links to do that are down below in the description. If you'd like to learn more about the fall of mass managerial bureaucracies, you can pick up my book, The Total State. And of course, if you'd like to watch my latest show or read my latest column, you can head over to The Blaze. Thank you everybody for watching, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.